Namaste and welcome. I'm Rita Manchanda, a research consultant and a rights activist. Our focus today is on one of the major challenges confronting the world today: people forcibly displaced from their homes and habitats. That is, the internally displaced within their own national borders, masses of refugees fleeing persecution and violent conflict, crossing international borders, and migrants escaping chronic poverty and deprivation, aspiring for more life opportunities. Globally, the scale and duration of these now so-called mixed migration movements are transforming our democratic politics and the value of our open societies. They are straining existing international humanitarian regimes and the global burden-sharing arrangements. Here are some global statistics at a glance. 71 million forcibly displaced, and in 2 decades that number has doubled. IDPs make up about 41 million, refugees 26 million, and asylum seekers about 3 to 4 million, and stateless about 4 million, and that's an underestimate. 57% of all the forcibly displaced are produced in 3 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, and Sudan. And 80% are hosted in developing countries, not Europe, not USA, but developing countries. In India itself, the figure is unknown or unavailable, but UNHCR assisted are about 36,000, largely from Myanmar, Afghanistan, Somalia, and the Middle East. Directly assisted by the government of India are Tibetan refugees, about 100,000, Sri Lankan refugees, about 63,000. Today, our specific topic is women refugees, prevention, protection, and empowerment within the human security framework. And our locational position is from, of course, India. Significantly, it emphasizes, that is the topic, the gendering of the refugee discourse as reflected in the attention on women refugees. Next, the people centering of the security discourse as epitomized in the phrase human security. Both have emerged from scholarly and activist struggles of women's groups and rights-based activists, and the evolution of the development discourse. This lecture draws upon scholarly literature of 3 disciplines: refugee studies, women, peace, security literature, and human security studies. Our topic posits 5 questions. Who is a refugee? Why is there a need to focus on women refugees? What is the international protection regime for refugees? And is it gendered? What is the value of bringing in a human security framework to refugee protection? And finally, what are the implications for India's policies and practices of refugee protection? So who is a refugee? A person who flees their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And this is derived from the 1951 Convention. Migrant. Who is a migrant? A migrant refers to someone who moves temporarily or permanently from one place or country to another. A migrant is someone who moves freely, and this is from the International Organization of Migration, the definition. So an asylum seeker, who is that? Refugees seeking protection from war or persecution who apply for refugee status under international and national laws. And finally, who is a stateless person? Stateless persons are not considered as nationals by any state under its laws. they are actually invisible, without the right to have any rights. And this definition is derived from the 1954 Convention. Then there are those that do not cross international borders. Who are they? They are the internally displaced persons, or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee, or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have, as I said, not crossed internationally recognized state borders. And this definition is from the UN Guiding Principles, 1998. They are vulnerable to multiple and protracted displacement. In fact, all forcible displaced categories are victims of forcible displacement cycles. And displacement is not only multiple but also circular. For today's IDP is tomorrow's refugee, crossing an international border, fleeing to Bangladesh, settling in Cox's Bazar settlements, crossing over to India, or becoming the boat people and sailing to Malaysia, and then perhaps, sadly, being deported back to IDP camps in Myanmar. So the refugee experience is actually not only multiple but circular. On what your status determination is, that is, whether you are categorized as an IDP, whether you're categorized as a refugee, whether you're categorized as a migrant or a stateless person, depends the degree, the nature, the scope of your legal rights and protection. Consequently, as you can imagine, there is a politics of status determination. For instance, the Syrians, refugees, and all of you are familiar with that exodus. They are fleeing the devastation of conflict and targeted persecution. But in the media discourse, persistently, whether it's BBC or CNN and so forth, they are called migrants. In fact, it's only Al Jazeera that explicitly states that there is no migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. There is a refugee crisis, but they are not called refugees. The term refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants have distinct meanings and cannot be used interchangeably. However, the spread of irregular migration and the trafficking of people have blurred the distinction between refugees and migration, which is why, in fact, the phrase of convenience is mixed migration. It is important to emphasize that the various categories carry different international obligation, but increasingly all these protection regimes are being eroded in the countries all over the world. As a result, there are renewed UN efforts to commit to the humanitarian principle of international burden sharing, to enshrine a human rights approach through the Global Compact on Refugees and Migrants. But it can barely hold back the rising tide of xenophobia, suspicion, and hostility towards the other. It is evident in the building of Fortress Europe, the detention camps in Australia, the wall in the US, and the holding camps in Turkey. When the international protection regime first emerged 7 decades or so ago to handle the forcible displacement of people post-World War II, the numbers were manageable. Non-citizens were actually welcome to ease the post-war labor shortage and, importantly, as geopolitical pawns in the Cold War. Today, the flows are huge. Syria, 6 to 7 million. Afghanistan, 2 to 3 million. In today's wars, forcible displacement is not only an incidental consequence, but the targeted objective. This is clearly evident with the Rohingyas, uprooted from Myanmar. Briefly, the international refugee regime is anchored in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, the 1967 Protocol, International human rights law has bridged many a gap in the international existing refugee regime, for instance, on family separation. Also, in today's normative framing, refugee protection is a human rights issue and not an act of charity at the discretion of states. The core tenet of the international protection regime is non-refoulement, or no pushback of a refugee to a situation of risk. The UN High Commission for Refugee is the international agency entrusted to provide international protection and settlement of refugees. In South Asia, except for Afghanistan, no country has acceded to the 1951 Convention or the Protocol. But like India, they all cooperate with UNHCR. Making explicit India's stand, the representative of India said that his delegation fully supported the work of UNHCR. His delegation was aware of the body of opinion that believed the solution to certain refugee problems lay in acceding to the Refugee Convention. But India did not share that view and had successfully managed such situations of its own accord and with its own resources. That's the Indian position. India has been wary of expanding the role of UNHCR and limits their protective responsibilities, especially in areas deemed sensitive from a national security perspective. For example, in relation to the Tibetan refugees and the Sri Lankan refugees, India has no domestic refugee law or policy. Undocumented migrants, refugees fall under the Foreigners Act 1946. Refugee response and praxis is ad hoc. But India's historical record of accommodating refugees has been quite impressive and generous. For instance, towards the refugee flows of 1971 from East Pakistan, the Tibetan refugees, the Sri Lankan refugees, Afghans, and now the Burmese. The Indian judicial system has extended the right to life to non-citizens, and that includes refugees. They have access to education, health, and livelihood. However, the recent deportation of Rohingya refugees as illegal migrants has raised concerns about violations of the fundamental principle of non-refoulement or pushback. India, of course, is not a member of the 1951 Convention, but non-refoulement is recognized as customary laws. Also, India is bound by multiple international human rights treaties, including the International Child Rights Convention and CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination against Discrimination against Women. Let me now turn to women refugees. The archetypal image of the civilian in conflict is that of a woman victim with small children clinging to her, fleeing across the border, or huddled in a tent in an IDP camp city within the country's borders, or in a refugee settlement in a neighboring host country. And women and children make up the majority of the world's refugees. Recognition of that statistical reality, as well as pressure from women's groups, has resulted in attention on women refugees, as opposed to dealing with refugees as a collective. It prompts a further set of questions. Is the international refugee protection regime structured around the paradigm of a male refugee? Are the policies of protection, care, and resettlement sensitive to gendered needs and gendered power relations? Since the 1990s, when refugee women became a policy priority for UNHCR, has the gendered gap in asylum processes and humanitarian response been bridged? Have we moved beyond first-generation concerns of visibilizing refugee women as vulnerable or enumerating female-headed household? Are we today integrating gender in second-generation concerns of preventing or supporting women as empowered, resilient decision makers? These questions are itself an outcrop of decades of struggle of women's groups in actual conflict situations in tandem with feminist scholarship and national and transnational advocacy to unpack the gendered knowledge frameworks, policy and norms so as to reflect the experiences of women in conflict, and that experience is gendered. The UN Security Council Resolution 1325 acknowledges the relevance of women to peace and security and foregrounds the gender-differentiated experience of women and girls in conflict, including forcible displacement. It challenged the gender blindness of refugee law. Gender asylum law was constructed on the edifice of the International Women's Human Rights Law. Subsequently, CEDAW, General Recommendation 30 on Women in Conflict, focused specifically on displacement, refugees and asylum seekers, and provided authoritative guidance to states on the Convention's applicability to every stage of the development cycle. However, as the 2015 Global Audit of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 ruefully observed, we are still far from embracing gender equality as an organizing principle in our humanitarian work, and this undermines the effectiveness of humanitarian assistance. Scholars remain critical of the efforts to mainstream gender in refugee protection. Ironically, in today's conflicts, refugees, asylum seekers, and the internally displaced are the most visible and vulnerable face of the civilian in war, and gendered power relations mark every stage of the development cycle. The role of gender in the very production of displacement, then in flight, then in the transitional shelter and resettlement process. Gender inequality increases the vulnerability of displaced women living in highly precarious conditions. Gender inequality shapes the social, political, and economic experience of women and men. Crises, natural or man-made, exaggerate the existing disadvantage and discrimination women suffer from due to their unequal status. It impacts their access to food, to health, shelter, land, productive assets, education, nationality, and documentation. So what is mainstreaming gender in refugee policy and praxis specifically concerned about? What are the gaps and weaknesses? First, refugee and IDP registration generally is done according to a family unit. So if you're unmarried or separated or a single woman, you will have to join a family unit to be registered. As we know, there are also cultural restrictions on mobility and therefore difficulty in accessing entitlements to, say, food, healthcare, and so forth. And on return, women are disadvantaged, even debarred from laying claim to land because they have no documents in their own name. The absence of the practice of registration of marriages further complicates this. Then asylum seeker status determination. Gender human rights violations are not or are only now beginning to be included in the general definition of refugees. And in fact, till recently, sexual violence in conflict was not constructed as a politically motivated or public violation. It was seen as a private act. That has changed after Rwanda and the Yugoslavia Crimes of War tribunals. Now, for instance, in relationship to widespread sexualized violence by the Myanmar security forces against the Rohingya women, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said, violence was visited upon women, including pregnant women, who are seen as custodians and propagators of ethnic identity, as well as on young children who represent the future of the group. Myanmar generals are on the UN watch list, as is Boko Haram, Nigeria, and the Lord's Resistance Army, Uganda. They are credibly suspected of using sexual violence in conflict. Systems also, another weakness, another gap in the refugee regime and praxis is systems of collecting sex disaggregated data are random and haphazard. That is, if you don't know how many pregnant women or lactating women are, then that can make the difference between survival of a mother and a child. For instance, in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, which has more than 1 million refugees, it's estimated that 48,000 Rohingya women were set to deliver babies in 2018. Now, if you don't know this figure, then how are you going to provide the care necessary? Also, then there is the lack of priority attention to the particular needs of only one gender, that is women. Menstrual hygiene, dignity kits, reproductive and maternal needs, abortion, post-rape trauma care, and pregnancies and antenatal care in highly unsanitary conditions, that requires priority attention. Rarely is it accorded. Refugee camps, as we all know, are magnets for traffickers, sexual exploitation and domestic violence in camps. Single women are vulnerable to survival sex. Then refugee women are not recognized as decision makers. Patriarchal prejudices reinforce, and instead of challenging practices of going through the men, this includes, say, appointing them in management committees in the camps, or determining where the location of water and sanitation facilities are concerned, we actually don't consult women. Why? Because culturally there's a prejudice and therefore we must go through the men, or because we don't think about it. There is a natural infantilization of women as if they are children. Let's now turn to our third and final framework of reference: human security. Why invoke the human security framework for refugee rights? What difference does a human rights framing of refugee protection make? There is an already, after all, existing international legal regime of refugee protection, and as discussed above, international human rights law supplements whatever gaps there is. So why bring in a normative framework of human security? Before addressing these questions, let us clarify what is meant by human security. I can do no better than quote from the 1994 UNDP Human Development Report that brought forward the concept of human security into international focus. It said, "For too long, nations have sought arms to protect their security. For most people today, a feeling of insecurity arises more from worries about daily life than from the dread of a cataclysmic world event. Most people instinctively understand what security means. It means safety from the constant threats of hunger, disease, crime, and repression. It also means protection from sudden and hurtful disruptions in the pattern of our daily life." Human security prompts the question: security of whom? Security from what? And security by what means? Human security involves a paradigmatic shift from security centered on the state and its territorial borders to people-centric security. It recognizes that there are many different dimensions to feeling safe: freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity. Human security complements national state security. Human security supports universalism, multilateralism, and the interdependence of the international system. Human security emerged from a development, not a security discourse. And as an integral part of the intellectual churning around more holistic ways of imagining a sustainable, peaceful world. Significantly, advocates of a human rights approach to forcible development have promoted the concept of human security, foregrounding that refugees are the litmus test for the state of human security worldwide. Indeed, the UN Human Rights Commissioner for Refugees, Sadako Ogato, and later the co-chair with Amartya Sen of the Commission for Human Security, emphasize that the importance of human security for refugees as a concept is clear if you consider that her office deals on a daily basis with people who are, by definition, insecure. Refugees and IDPs are a significant symptom of the human insecurity crisis. They flee because they are afraid, and in fleeing, they start a precarious existence. However, the impregnation of the notion of human security has suffered a setback in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001. State security, militarization, unilateralism again have claimed the agenda. Human security remained an important part of the international agenda, especially the refugee and migration agenda, but is noticeable that there are references to refugees and asylum seekers in most UN resolutions on terrorism. Normalization of the securitization discourse via the pathway of human security actually has reinforced the negative association of refugees as security threats. However, the very introduction of the human security framework, its holistic framing of security, draws important attention to one, the root causes of displacement. And that is extremely important because it draws attention then to how can we prevent forcible displacement. That is, the absence of peace and security, human rights violations, the varying degrees of development of judicial and democratic institutions are all factors affecting international migration. Then human security approaches emphasize the importance of the responsibility of national, regional, and international authorities to intervene and engage in preventive efforts to diffuse situations that produce displacement. Human security foregrounds not only freedom from fear and from want, but also freedom of action, that is, empowerment. It effectively shifts emphasis away from vulnerability of refugees to recognition of refugees as rights holder and as agents of their own security and future. There is, however, as mentioned, the securitization of the human security frame. It reinforces the unhappy tendency to view refugees as threats to national borders and security, not as victims or persons at risk of insecurity. For instance, the 40,000 Muslim Bengali-speaking Rohingya refugees are trapped in this securitized paradigm, described by the UN as the most persecuted group in the world and the victims of a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. The Rohingyas have sought refuge status in India since 2008. Earlier, they were beneficiaries of the Indian government's accommodative policy of long-term visas. But the Rohingyas today are treated as illegal migrants and illegal Bengalis. This is irrespective of the UNHCR status determination of 18,000 Rohingyas in India as refugees. Since August 2017, the Indian government has been cracking down on the Rohingyas as threats to national security, denying the refugee status. State governments have been directed to identify and deport in a continuous manner the Rohingyas living in India. And they are saying that they are vulnerable of getting recruited by terrorist organizations. A couple of Rohingya refugees have invoked the protection of the Supreme Court against deportation. However, dozens of Rohingyas have already been deported back to Myanmar, despite UNHCR's warning that the situation in Myanmar has, if anything, got worse. Of course, India's concern about radicalization amongst desperate refugees and stateless people is real. However, there is as yet no evidence of any terrorist involvement. Earlier, when India was confronted with the security risks of terrorists amidst a refugee population in the context of the Sri Lankan refugee situation, screening procedures were instituted. There was no closure of camps or deportation. India's accommodative record of refugee protection is a proud one. Incorporation of a human security framework will speak to India's state's interest while reinforcing its human rights objectives. Let me stop here. There is much for you to reflect upon about forcible displacement, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is one of the most challenging crises of our time. Thank you.